In the rocky heights of Ethiopia, where time seems to have stood still and ancestral traditions echo through the centuries, rests one of humanity's best-kept secrets. Among monasteries carved into the living rock and manuscripts wrapped in golden silk lies a version of the Bible that challenges everything we have been taught about the origins of humankind. This is not simply a regional variation of the scriptures, but a disturbing testimony to truths that were deliberately hidden by the powers that shaped Western Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the world's oldest Christian communities, preserved texts that European religious authorities deemed too dangerous to be included in the official canon. While distant councils decided which books deserved to be part of the scriptures, Ethiopian monks continued copying and preserving manuscripts that contained explosive revelations about the true nature of creation and the fall of humanity. These texts, written in the ancient liturgical Ge'ez language, kept alive a tradition dating back to the beginnings of early Judaism and Christianity. Among these preserved works, the Book of Enoch stands out, accepted as canonical by the Ethiopian Church, but rejected and suppressed by Western Christianity. This is not a mere historical curiosity or theological speculation, but a detailed account that sheds light on the most enigmatic passages of the Book of Genesis. Where the traditional Bible offers only cryptic fragments about the sons of God and the daughters of men, the Ethiopian text reveals a complete narrative that explains not only who these entities were, but how their actions permanently altered the course of human history. The question that has tormented theologians and scholars for millennia finally finds its answer in the yellowed pages of these ancient manuscripts. Did angels truly have relations with human beings? The answer is not just yes, but it is accompanied by details that explain the cosmic consequences of this transgression. What we find in these pages is not primitive mythology or regional folklore, but a systematic account of events that shape the very nature of spiritual and physical reality. You must wonder why these truths have been hidden for so long. The answer lies in the transformative power of this revelation. Accepting the veracity of these texts means recognizing that our understanding of sacred history was deliberately limited and censored. It means admitting that the religious authorities who shaped Western Christianity made conscious decisions about what humanity could or could not know about its own origins. The Ethiopian manuscripts represent more than ancient texts. They are evidence of a conspiracy of silence that lasted for centuries. The Ethiopian tradition did not arise in a vacuum. It represents the uninterrupted continuity of a lineage of knowledge that directly connects the first followers of Christianity with the Jewish communities that preserved the original texts. While European Christianity went through successive doctrinal reformulations, adapting to the political whims of emperors and popes, the Ethiopian Church remained geographically isolated, protected by the mountains and deserts surrounding the Ethiopian plateau. This isolation, which some might consider a disadvantage, actually became the safeguard of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. The monks who transcribed these texts were not mere copyists, but guardians of a sacred tradition that they understood to be under constant threat. Each manuscript was a declaration of resistance against the forces that sought to standardize and control the religious narrative. Every carefully preserved word represented an act of faith not only in God, but in the importance of keeping the complete truth alive, regardless of how disturbing that truth might be to the established power structures. The 6th chapter of Genesis has always been a source of unease for biblical scholars. The few lines describing the sons of God taking wives from among the daughters of men seem out of place in the traditional creation narrative. For centuries, theologians tried to explain these passages as metaphors or allegories, carefully avoiding the literal implications of the text. Some suggested that the sons of God were simply the descendants of Seth, while others proposed increasingly elaborate interpretations to circumvent the obvious implication that celestial beings physically related to human women. The Ethiopian version eliminates all ambiguity. The Book of Enoch leaves no room for metaphorical interpretations when it describes with surgical precision the events that preceded the flood. 200 angels, known as Watchers or Grigori, descended from heaven during the days of Jared, Enoch's father. These were not ethereal messengers or symbolic manifestations of divine will, but entities with form, free will, and the capacity to make decisions that directly contradicted the Creator's designs. Led by Semjaza, also known as Samyaza, these rebellious angels made a pact among themselves on Mount Hermon. They knew they were about to violate the fundamental laws of creation, and so they united in a solemn oath, agreeing that all would participate in the transgression, so that no one would bear the blame for what was to come alone. This premeditation reveals not only the gravity of their acts, but also their full awareness of the consequences that would follow. The Ethiopian text describes how these angels were overcome by desire when contemplating the beauty of human women. This was not a casual attraction or a moment of fleeting weakness, but an obsession that led them to completely abandon their celestial duties. They took wives from among the daughters of men, and with them begot offspring that would forever change the balance between the celestial and the earthly. The children born of these unions were not simply great in physical stature. They represented a new category of being, hybrids who possessed both angelic and human characteristics. These hybrids, known as the Nephilim, became a plague upon the earth. Their gigantic stature was only the most visible aspect of their corrupt nature. They possessed insatiable appetites, not only for food, but for violence and domination. As they grew in number and power, they began to devour everything within their reach, consuming not only the earth's resources, but eventually turning against each other and even against common human beings. Their presence transformed the world into a battlefield where the natural order was completely subverted. But the corruption did not stop at mere procreation. The fallen angels brought with them knowledge that was not intended for human beings. They taught their wives and descendants the arts of war, weapon-making, sorcery, and astrology. Azazel, one of the leaders of the Watchers, instructed men in the forging of swords and shields, while others revealed the secrets of cosmetics, jewelry, and adornments that inflamed human vanity. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of magical roots, introducing humanity to practices that connected it directly with dark spiritual forces. Astronomical and meteorological knowledge was also prematurely transmitted to humanity. The angels revealed the signs of the sun, moon, and stars, knowledge that should have been discovered gradually through patient observation and study. This accelerated transfer of knowledge completely unbalanced the natural development of human civilization, creating a technologically advanced but morally corrupt society where power was wielded without wisdom and science was used for destructive ends. The Ethiopian tradition presents these events not as mythology, but as factual history. For the faithful of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the angelic intervention in human history is an established fact that explains not only the origins of violence and corruption in the world, but also the divine necessity for a drastic intervention to restore cosmic order. This perspective offers a coherent explanation for the moral degeneration that led to the flood, presenting it not as arbitrary punishment, but as a necessary response to a contamination that threatened to completely destroy the integrity of creation. Enoch emerges in the Ethiopian tradition not only as a patriarchal figure, but as a cosmic prophet whose mission transcended anything previously revealed in Western scriptures. While the traditional biblical text briefly mentions that Enoch walked with God and was no more because God took him, the Ethiopian version develops this enigmatic statement into an epic narrative that reveals Enoch as a divine intermediary between heaven and the corrupt earth. His function was not simply that of a righteous man taken up to heaven, but that of a special envoy designated to confront the cosmic crisis caused by the rebellion of the Watchers. The Ethiopian book describes how Enoch was chosen by the Most High to serve as a celestial scribe and divine spokesman. He not only witnessed the supernatural events of his time, but was called to document them for future generations. His journey through the seven heavens reveals a complex cosmology where each celestial level has its own functions and inhabitants. In these higher dimensions, Enoch encountered the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, each responsible for specific aspects of divine administration, and all deeply troubled by the rebellion of their fallen brethren. During his celestial travels, Enoch witnessed the judgment of the rebellious angels. The Ethiopian text describes in vivid detail how the Watchers were brought before the throne of the Most High, where their pleas for mercy were rejected. Divine justice could not be compromised. the corruption introduced into creation required complete atonement. Enoch was then entrusted with an impossible mission to return to earth and communicate their eternal condemnation to the fallen angels. This was not a task he could refuse, for it came directly from the Creator, but it was also not a message the condemned would receive with resignation. The Ethiopian tradition reveals that Enoch spent earthly years traveling among the corrupted communities, proclaiming both the imminent judgment and offering one last opportunity for repentance. His words fell on hardened ears. The Nephilim and their angelic fathers had fully committed to their rebellion. Instead of accepting divine correction, they intensified their destructive practices, as if the awareness of their condemnation freed them from any remaining moral restraint. This final rejection sealed not only their own fate, but confirmed that only a drastic intervention could restore order to creation. But Enoch was not just a messenger of condemnation. He also received prophetic visions that extended far beyond his own time. The Ethiopian text describes how the secrets of the future were revealed to him, including details about the coming flood, the preservation of the righteous lineage through Noah, and events that would unfold until the end of time. These revelations were not simply information about the future, but constituted a comprehensive divine plan for the redemption of corrupted creation. Enoch understood that the events of his time were only the first act of a cosmic drama that would culminate in the final restoration of all things. The preservation of these texts by the Ethiopian Church represents more than historical continuity. It constitutes an act of theological resistance against attempts to simplify or sanitize the biblical narrative. While other Christian traditions rejected the Book of Enoch as apocryphal, classifying it as pseudepigraphic literature without canonical authority, the Ethiopian Church maintained its inclusion in the official scriptures. This decision was not taken lightly. It reflects a deep understanding that certain spiritual truths cannot be eliminated simply because they challenge conventional theological interpretations. The authority of the Enochian text in the Ethiopian tradition is based not only on its antiquity, but on its capacity to explain elements of human experience that remain incomprehensible without this additional revelation. The existence of evil, the seemingly inherent corruption of human nature, the presence of knowledge that seems to have a superhuman origin, all these phenomena find a coherent explanation in the narrative of the fallen angels and their interference in creation. Removing this narrative from the biblical canon leaves inexplicable gaps in the theological understanding of the human condition. The Ethiopian manuscripts also preserve details about the sacred geography associated with the Enochian events. Mount Hermon, identified as the location of the Watchers' original descent, became a landmark in the spiritual topography of the Middle East. The caves and valleys where the Nephilim established their domains were documented with a precision that suggests real geographical knowledge, not mythological construction. This attention to physical details reinforces the Ethiopian perspective that the events described in the Book of Enoch constitute factual history, not spiritual allegory. The universal flood gains a completely new dimension when understood through the Ethiopian perspective. Far from being simply a divine punishment for generic human wickedness, the cataclysm emerges as a surgical response to a specific contamination that threatened to forever destroy the integrity of divine creation. The Ethiopian narrative reveals that God did not destroy the world in a fit of rage, but made a calculated decision to preserve the possibility of future redemption. The water that covered the earth was not an instrument of arbitrary condemnation, but an agent of cosmic purification that removed a corruption that could not be corrected by other means. The presence of the Nephilim had created a fundamental imbalance in the natural order. These angel-human hybrids were not limited to causing physical violence. Their very existence represented a violation of the ontological categories established in creation. Neither fully celestial nor completely terrestrial, they occupied an intermediate space that should not exist. Their continued reproduction would have resulted in the complete hybridization of the human race, forever eliminating the possibility of human beings genuinely created in the divine image. The flood, therefore, was not divine genocide, but cosmic surgery necessary to preserve authentic humanity. The choice of Noah as a survivor was also not arbitrary. The Ethiopian tradition emphasizes that Noah and his family represented a genetically pure lineage, uncontaminated by the blood of the Watchers. This purity was not merely moral, but biological and spiritual. The preservation of Noah ensured that post-diluvian humanity maintained its original connection with the divine, without the angelic interference that had corrupted the antediluvian generations. The ark thus became more than a means of physical survival. It was the vehicle through which authentic humanity was transported through the cosmic catastrophe. But the flood did not completely erase the legacy of the Watchers. The Ethiopian tradition recognizes that some aspects of the corruption survived the cataclysm. The forbidden knowledge taught by the fallen angels was partially preserved and resurfaced in later civilizations. Magic, astrology, advanced weapon-making, and other forbidden arts gradually reappeared in human history, suggesting that the original contamination left lasting marks on humanity's collective consciousness. This persistence explains why evil continued to be present in the post-diluvian world, despite the cosmic purification. The Ethiopian perspective on these events directly challenges the sanitized interpretations of Western Christianity. While European theologians transformed the flood into a moral parable about obedience and disobedience, the Ethiopian tradition maintains its cosmic and supernatural dimension. This difference is not merely academic, it reflects fundamentally distinct approaches to the nature of spiritual reality. Western Christianity, influenced by Greek philosophy and the political needs of the Roman Empire, tended to demythologize the biblical narratives, reducing them to abstract ethical principles. The Ethiopian Church, isolated from these influences, preserved an older and more literal understanding of the sacred texts. This literal preservation does not represent theological primitivism, but spiritual sophistication. The Ethiopian Church understands that certain truths can only be transmitted through concrete narrative, not philosophical abstraction. The story of the Watchers and the flood offers an explanatory model for spiritual phenomena that persist in human experience. The attraction to forbidden knowledge, the tension between celestial and earthly impulses in human nature, and the periodic need for spiritual purification to maintain the connection with the divine. The Ethiopian manuscripts also preserve details about the period immediately following the flood. They describe how Noah and his children faced the trauma of being the only survivors of their species, carrying not only the responsibility of repopulating the earth, but also the terrible memory of the events that made the destruction of everything they knew necessary. This psychological dimension of the flood narrative is rarely explored in other traditions, but the Ethiopian version recognizes that physical survival was only the first challenge. The spiritual and emotional recovery of humanity required generations. The post-diluvian geography also received special attention in the Ethiopian tradition. The texts describe how the terrestrial topography itself was altered by the cataclysm, creating new mountains, valleys, and watercourses. This physical reorganization of the world symbolized the spiritual renewal that the flood had made possible. The earth emerged from the waters not only physically transformed, but spiritually purified, offering surviving humanity the opportunity to restart its relationship with the divine on a more solid basis. The discovery and rediscovery of the Enochian texts in the modern era revealed the gulf between Ethiopian preservation and Western oblivion. For centuries, European scholars considered the Book of Enoch a minor historical curiosity, known only through Greek fragments and some citations in patristic texts. The very existence of a complete and authoritative version remained unknown in the Western academic world, until travelers and missionaries began to bring back reports about the rich manuscript tradition of the Ethiopian Church. What they discovered was not simply an ancient text preserved by chance, but a living and continuous tradition that maintained these writings as an integral part of its faith. The importance of this discovery became even more evident with the excavation of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century. Among the scrolls found in the caves of Qumran were Aramaic and Hebrew fragments of the Book of Enoch, confirming that the text had circulated widely among Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. These archaeological findings dramatically validated the Ethiopian preservation, demonstrating that the Ethiopian Church had maintained not a regional peculiarity, but a central element of the primitive Judeo-Christian tradition that had been lost elsewhere. The comparison between the Qumran fragments and the Ethiopian manuscripts revealed a remarkable fidelity in the textual transmission across centuries. Despite the geographical and temporal distance, the versions coincided in substantial details, suggesting that the Ethiopian scribes had fulfilled their responsibility as guardians of tradition with exceptional dedication. This fidelity was not limited to the words of the texts, but extended to the underlying theological understanding. The Ethiopian church had preserved not only the letters, but the spirit of the Enochian texts. But why were these texts suppressed in other Christian traditions? The answer reveals fundamental tensions between different views of religious authority and the nature of divine revelation. As Christianity became institutionalized under Roman imperial patronage, it became necessary to establish a unified orthodoxy that could be hierarchically controlled. The Enochian texts, with their emphasis on direct revelation and individual prophetic communication, represented a potential threat to this model of centralized authority. Accepting Enoch's canonicity would mean recognizing that divine revelation had not ceased with the apostles and could continue through later visionaries. Furthermore, the specific content of the Book of Enoch created theological problems for a church seeking accommodation with Greek philosophy and Roman culture. The literal narrative of rebellious angels and supernatural hybrids conflicted with intellectual trends that favored more abstract and philosophical interpretations of the scriptures. It was easier to explain human evil in terms of free will and individual moral responsibility than to confront the implications of a cosmic corruption that transcended human capacity for understanding or control. The Book of Enoch offered inconveniently specific explanations for phenomena that theologians preferred to leave mysterious. The exclusion of these texts from the Western canon also served broader political purposes. A church seeking legitimacy within the Roman imperial system could not easily accept narratives that presented celestial authorities rebelling against the established order by their superior. The parallel with political rebellion was too obvious to be ignored. It was safer to promote a theology that emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and the sanctity of existing authority structures. The Book of Enoch, with its celebration of prophetic resistance and its implicit critique of corrupt power, represented a dangerous precedent. The Ethiopian church, geographically isolated from these political and cultural pressures, was able to maintain an older and less compromised theological perspective. Its location in the mountains of the Ethiopian plateau offered protection not only against military invasions, but against intellectual influences that could have diluted its unique tradition. This isolation, which some historians considered a disadvantage for Ethiopian theological development, actually preserved elements of primitive Christian faith that were lost elsewhere. The modern rediscovery of these texts forced a re-evaluation of the origins of Christianity and Judaism. Scholars recognized that the communities that produced and preserved the Book of Enoch were not fringe sects or heretical groups, but representatives of mainstream currents of Jewish religious thought during the formative period of Christianity. The exclusion of these texts from the later canon represented not the elimination of spurious elements, but the triumph of a specific theological faction over others equally legitimate. This re-evaluation has profound implications for the contemporary understanding of biblical authority. If texts like the Book of Enoch were excluded, not for intrinsic theological reasons, but for political and cultural considerations, then the current canon reflects not only divine revelation, but also human decisions influenced by specific historical circumstances. Recognizing this reality does not necessarily diminish the authority of the scriptures, but invites a more nuanced understanding of how that authority was constituted and exercised throughout history. The contemporary relevance of the Ethiopian Enochian tradition extends far beyond academic interest or historical curiosity. In an age when questions about the nature of reality, the origin of evil, and the limits of human knowledge have resurfaced with renewed urgency, the texts preserved by the Ethiopian Church offer perspectives that were deliberately excluded from the mainstream religious discourse. These are not simply relics of the past, but living resources for understanding spiritual dilemmas that persist in contemporary human experience. The Watcher's narrative provides a conceptual framework for examining questions that conventional theological explanations leave unsatisfactorily answered. Why does humanity seem to possess knowledge that transcends its apparently natural origin? Where do the destructive impulses that seem inherent in human nature come from? How to explain the simultaneous presence of noble capacities and degrading tendencies in the same species? The Ethiopian tradition offers answers that locate these contradictions not in flaws of the original divine design, but in later interferences that corrupted the initial creation. This perspective has profound implications for human self-understanding. Instead of accepting wickedness as a natural component of the human condition, the Enochian tradition suggests that it represents a distortion of something originally pure. This distinction is not merely comforting. It offers genuine hope that corruption can be identified, confronted, and eventually overcome. Humanity is not condemned to endlessly repeat the destructive patterns of the past, because these patterns are not part of its essential nature. The Ethiopian preservation of these texts also invites reflection on the mechanisms through which knowledge is controlled and distributed. The exclusion of the Book of Enoch from the Western canon was not a historical accident, but the result of conscious decisions made by individuals and institutions with specific agendas. Recognizing this reality raises disturbing questions about what other truths may have been suppressed or distorted to serve particular interests. The Ethiopian tradition represents not only the preservation of ancient texts, but an example of intellectual and spiritual resistance against attempts to monopolize religious truth. In our age of increasing skepticism towards traditional institutions, the Ethiopian experience offers an alternative model of religious authority. Instead of relying on centralized hierarchies or externally imposed dogmas, the Ethiopian Church maintained its fidelity to the texts it considered authentic, regardless of external pressures. This intellectual autonomy did not produce theological anarchy, but preserved a doctrinal coherence that remains to this day. The lesson is clear. It is possible to maintain spiritual integrity without forced institutional conformity. The prophetic dimension of the Enochian texts also powerfully resonates with contemporary concerns. The description of dangerous knowledge being prematurely transmitted to humanity echoes modern anxieties about uncontrolled technological development and its unintended consequences. Just as the Watchers introduced martial arts and magical practices that humanity was not prepared to use responsibly, our own era witnesses the proliferation of technologies whose ethical and social implications have not yet been fully understood. The Ethiopian tradition does not offer simple answers to these contemporary dilemmas, but it provides a conceptual framework that recognizes the real complexity of the challenges we face. It suggests that not all knowledge is beneficial, that not all progress represents genuine improvement, and that humanity needs spiritual wisdom to navigate the possibilities opened by technical advancement. This perspective contrasts sharply with both naive technological optimism and equally simplistic apocalyptic pessimism. Finally, the Ethiopian experience demonstrates that suppressed truths have a remarkable ability to resurface when conditions are appropriate. The texts that Western religious authorities considered safe to discard remained alive in the mountains of Ethiopia, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge into world consciousness. This resurrection was not accidental. It responded to spiritual and intellectual needs that the dominant traditions could not adequately satisfy. The Ethiopian Bible, with its unique preservation of the Book of Enoch and other suppressed traditions, remains a testament to the possibility of successful spiritual resistance. It proves that temporal powers can suppress truths for centuries, but they cannot destroy them permanently. For those who seek to understand the hidden dimensions of human experience, the manuscripts guarded in Ethiopian monasteries offer perspectives that were deliberately excluded from conventional religious discourse. They invite not only academic study, but a fundamental reconsideration of who we are, where we came from, and where our spiritual journey can take us when all suppressed truths finally come to light.